This is a podcast which does not shy away from difficult and vulnerable topics, and we ask you to take care of yourselves when you listen. The content is of an adult nature, and we do swear at times.
Welcome to the Autistic Licence podcast. I'm Leo in London.
I'm Shauna, and I'm Carrickfergus in Northern Ireland.
We invite you to listen in on our conversations as we experiment with unmasking in an autistic space. We talk about what it means to discover we're autistic as adults, especially with established careers as therapists. We want people to know that autistic therapists exist and to broaden the conversation about neurodiversity. You're so welcome to join us, whoever you are and wherever in the world you are. We hope you'll find something of interest and connection here.
It is really lovely to meet you both.
That's really lovely. Thank you. This is the first time we've done this. I think you might know that, but we haven't done this before, so it's quite exciting.
Oh, yes. No, Daniel doesn't know that he's the first person that we've actually talked to. So, yeah.
Exciting. Big debut.
Your debut, yeah.
We did just read your initial email again, just to kind of refresh the background and a little bit about what your story is so far. Is there anything that you want, again, without in any way wanting to put you on the spot, but do you want to say anything at all about who you are or something about yourself and your story?
I'd be delighted to. My usual elevator pitch is more work focused, more my professional life, which forms a big part of me in my life and my day to day, but not necessarily something I'm here to talk about in depth. So I'm Daniel. I am 31, self-diagnosed AuDHD. I think possibly more on the autism side, with some ADHD traits in there. Currently on the pathway through the NHS to be diagnosed, which, as you well know, is a very long waiting list and is quite a long process. At the same time, I'm very certain of myself that this is a truth for me. It's been a fair journey over this year, I would say, really coming to that realization. And your podcast has actually played a part in it. So it is really wonderful to be on here and to talk to you both. It probably started last year, and I went through my Google search history and found myself kind of searching for online autism tests to have a little test after someone that I've been working with on a reasonably short-term project they'd shared a lot of their experiences, and they quite often contrasted themselves to neurotypicals. And a lot of the things I was hearing, I was thinking, that doesn't sound so unusual to me. And, of course, it led me to kind of Google and look it up. At the time, my wife was very pregnant. We had a lot of things going on, and I put a pause on it for a while, it's fair to say, and kind of let it slip into the background. And then earlier this year, I think it was the ADHD Chatter podcast, my wife showed me an episode of it, and it was a couple on there, ADHD Love, I think they've got their own podcast.
Yes, I know that one. I know that one.
Yeah, entertaining.
On Instagram.
So, videos
that they do, yes.
Exactly. I don't follow much social media, so it's all my wife showing me this content. But I saw this episode on the ADHD Chatter podcast, and it was him talking about how he might be autistic after all. And then afterwards, my wife turned to me and said, do you think you might be autistic? And I was like, you know what, I am. And I kind of started that journey to actually discovering what it means, doing the hyper focus around the research, and in terms of it coming to understand it more myself. And of course, it's a long journey, reframing my experiences, my past, and seeing it in a new light, picking through all of it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I noticed that you referred to your wife being involved in it as well, and I think that's a really key part as well of it, that you discover together and then you look back over things together. And I'm also thinking, you have a little one. Have you got a little girl? Is it a little girl?
Yeah. She is 15 months old, and it's quite a little firestorm running around there.
Yes. Yes. It's a wonderful time to find out you're autistic, though, when you're a new parent, I think, because it helps, like, you do that at the same time as getting to know your child who might be autistic too, let's be honest. So, like, it just kind of, it can all go together. And then you're kind of able to separate out and not be like, trying to work with them and not really being real about what's going on with you or what your past might have been or your struggles might have been. And then you don't have to take all the advice from the non-autistic people, because you're like, well, actually, this is my kid and I need to dig deep in myself to know how to relate to them, as opposed to read books and, which are often not autistic friendly.
Yeah, I agree.
Off my soapbox.
The other thing I immediately thought, though, when you said that had partly come from your wife, was that that's somebody you then don't have to convince. It's sometimes when it's the other way around and it comes from you, you then have to it ripples out, and you don't know what resistance you might meet about people go, no, not really, surely. But so that's really lovely that actually was a shared experience and an external observation of something about you as well.
Absolutely. And at the same time, really, my wife has been discovering more about her ADHD too. So we are both neurodiverse, and the rule applies that the neurodiverse attract the neurodiverse. And our relationship is no different. I think it's formed quite an important bonding aspect, really, of how we came together and how we connect. And she's been on a similar journey understanding her ADHD over the year, although I think I've probably dived a little more into it than she has. I think to some degree I fear invalidation. And so to a degree, I feel like I need to wait until I've got a formal diagnosis to share it with my parents. I don't feel that same need when talking to colleagues at work. I've been increasingly open about that. And I'm hoping I'm in a privileged position with my work. I work in tech, and it has a great benefits package with it. And
you are not alone in your neurotype in that industry by any means.
Exactly. It's well supported. In fact, it's usually one that's quite well correlated with success in a lot of factors. And hopefully pursuing private diagnosis, which would be a lot quicker than going through the NHS route. And I have hope that I'm more likely to have that assessment with a psychiatrist who is more familiar with late diagnoses and therefore more open to it. I guess I've got a fear in there that, again, it's going back to a fear of being invalidated, which I don't think would end my quest for this, but
I would hope not.
Would present a challenge.
What I would say with my kind of professional hat on, as well as my own experience, is that is absolutely universal. I've yet to speak to any autistic person who didn't doubt at some level their own self-diagnosis. Even with me, it was right the way through the process. Even after he had said in an email, I remember the phrase exactly, I am 100% convinced that a diagnosis of ASD is fully justified. I was still expecting him to, oh no, Leo. Oh no, I meant somebody else. Sorry, terrible mistake. Like you, it was my truth, my identity, but it is universal, that doubt all the way through, and that fear of invalidation as well.
I felt like I knew what to say and how to answer the questions, and then I felt like I had deceived the assessor anyway, because I just knew what she was going to ask and I knew all my examples of it. And so I don't even think that going for diagnosis reaffirmed it for me, because I felt like I could just perform just like I perform. It wouldn't matter. So I think it's such a conundrum, because some people think it's going to validate it for them, but it can just bring more questions around, well, did I just do a really good performance on that day, or did I just pay for it, actually? And as long as she can tick boxes, then, so I don't know. It probably needs to come out of the medical arena altogether, and that would stop all of this. Like we don't go for diagnosis of our, of our sexual identity or anything else. So why should we have to go for it in terms of our neurological identity? Like we know what we know. The invalidation thing is massive, but it is a real thing. I think that the majority of people who knew me as a masked person really believe that that's real me, and so they just can't get past that was an elaborate way to survive. And it just, because it also, like, even I think it's real in lots of ways. I don't see it as a false self, and even though it was a sort of a performance, it still was real, but not the full picture. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe people think it's the full picture, but it's only the adaptive survival form. But it's tricky because I think people could get offended because they would think, well, if you put on such a good performance, then how am I ever going to know that you're not performing now?
Good point.
And I mean, I don't. Like, is there another layer? I don't know.
Yeah, no one I've said it to so far has invalidated me in any degree, and I don't know if that reflects the quality of the people I'm engaging with, the level at which they think they know me, or the fact that I am obviously ASD to these people. I'm not sure which is the right answer. I work within what is my special interest, I suppose, or one of mine, which is AI, artificial intelligence, and I am very passionate about it, outspoken, and some people thought they're doing my specific application within the field. And
feel free to expand.
Can you tell us what you? Yeah,
but I was going to say, do feel free to expand on it. It doesn't.
I want to know.
We have to talk about autism. We don't. We talk.
Especially what you do.
So I am a management consultant, which effectively, it's hard to simplify because it's quite complex. It's going around analysing businesses, helping them to understand how they can transition to a better place. I think it actually plays a lot into autistic strength systematization, especially because it's about the holistic picture. It's looking at the interconnected nature of people, of systems, of organizations, and the IT which they employ. So for me, I thrive within the domain. And early last year, I had my first play with ChatGPT, which of course is, exploding at the moment in popularity continually. And for me, I had something of an existential crisis when I used it, which is a line I use quite often in my public speaking around this. But it is true. And I, have been crafting my career for several years, focusing on business transformation, helping organizations set up new capabilities. And then I had my first play with it, put in something simple, this basic analysis that we use within business analysis, and it output something that was really high quality. And I just had this realization that it can produce this at this earlier level of maturity. So I had this kind of spark, this urgency to pivot, and cue me doing quite a lot of deep research and hyper focusing on it to quite a considerable extent. I kind of took it on board. Our daughter was born, so I took a little break from it for a while. As I'm privileged in the benefits package that I have available to me, so I took a good few months out of work while she was a newborn. And then this year I've been absolutely unequivocally focused on AI, its application in business, which ranges from speaking at a conference to speaking on another podcast. This is technically my second podcast I'm a guest on this.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But then, I've been focused on that in my work now all year. I've been writing a book, which is quite a monumental piece to be pulling together. The kind of hyper focus helped on the first 25,000 words, I would say, when I just info dumped out into the book. It took a little pause for a while after I kind of burned out on it a little, but I'm starting to pick it up again now and starting to info dump quite enthusiastically once again. So it's starting to take a little more shape.
And is it focused on only on business, or is it focused on like AI in a wider context?
A touch of both, in that it fundamentally transforms business models. I mean, this is my perspective. This is what I talk about. Those business models are the kind of what sits beneath everything that is commerce within our world, and our world being a capitalist society and running on capitalist means, commerce, money, essentially. I see this as transforming our day-to-day lives effectively. And that's kind of the starting point. What the technology, what the architectures can enable in terms of advancing and accelerating technology is, again, just absolutely enthralling. And I think we'll move forwards technology in our day-to-day lives within the next decade to where we're living almost in this sci-fi world. You know, I'm a fan of Isaac Asimov's series of novels. I have most of them in print and I've read most of them multiple times, and you know, I can see elements of that in our future, elements of, you know, absolutely fantastical tech that changes our lives for the better, which is, you know, part of what I capture within my book as well.
Isaac Asimov is my mum's hero. He was actually, not for some years now, I think about it, but that was her kind of one niche of absolutely kind of obsessive reading, was that kind of very sorry, I'm trying to describe something about, like, the way that Black Mirror is only just a little bit in the future, that it wasn't, hey, isn't this great in space and we've got these ray guns, like a lot of science fiction was in the 50s and 60s, that this was just a lot more cerebral and realistic and you know, dealt with a lot of, it was him that wrote the Laws of Robotics, wasn't it? And yeah, exactly those kinds of things that you will need, and that wasn't dependent on futurism for futurism's sake. And yeah, I remember she got very excited because the university that I went to, and I never visited that particular library, but owned the largest sci-fi library, either in Europe or the world. I can't remember at the time. This is in the 80s, so it was all print. And she was very excited about things that she wanted to get hold of. Sorry, off on a tangent, as we'd like to do, but because you mentioned Isaac Asimov, who I haven't thought about for a long time.
I think it's lovely whenever people get talking like that, Daniel, and it's like, yeah, he's autistic. It's such a gift, because you can't do that. You can't be like that unless you're autistic. Like, it just has to be like a passion that bubbles up and that's just there, and that you see all the connections. And I know you're actually, like, part of what you're doing in business is finding the patterns, which is obviously an autistic thing to do, but even just how you talk about things, and then how it, you can see all the tendrils kind of coming off it. So as a therapist, there's a bit of a question going around, like, will AI replace us as human beings? Do you have any kind of comments about that? And you can say whatever. Like, I'm not going to be offended. By the time that happens, I'm going to want out anyway. So, but
therapist specifically, or
yeah, therapist specifically, because I'm interested in this as a, because it's a podcast, autistic therapist. That'll interest some people that are listening to it.
I don't think it will replace. I think it maybe opens up access to individuals who otherwise wouldn't be going to therapy, perhaps. And I have seen so much online of people that are using ChatGPT, for example, as their therapist.
Yes, yeah.
I do think ultimately, I mean, especially if you're in the privileged position to afford it or have it through other means, I understand it to be quite difficult via the NHS to get access to it, and probably even more difficult to get access to an autistic therapist, if at all possible. I think it's about human connection. I don't think you necessarily get the same value out of talking to a machine. One of the things that I highlight within my conference presentation a few months ago, I was talking about how AI impacts business analysis in the future. And I had these 4 characterizing questions which represented where you're kind of in a safe spot or where you might want to pivot to if you're not already there. And one of them was something called business change, which is all about the practice of applying new things within a business and then helping people adapt to it, adopt it, and making sure that it embeds effectively. And to me, while that's something that could be augmented or perhaps even directed by an AI in the future, it's still going to need a human face, because there's something, I think, psychologically inherent in two people interacting and that understanding passing between them, ideally without any masking when we're talking about autistic connection. For that reason, I think that you're safe.
I'm listening to what you're saying, though, and I can see the complementary nature of it, and I can see how, if it was used very sensitively, that, you know, you could have the human connection, you could have the strategic meetings that were like that, but then strategic, I don't know if strategic is the right word, but the key meetings that are like that, and then you could have supplementary coaching almost, or like the questions that you need to be asked repeatedly just to get it into your mind and to help those pathways to go. That could be done in different ways, and we need to find that, because you're absolutely right, there's very few people who can actually afford to access the level of the therapy that they really need. So there needs to be other ways to do this, but it's probably not that thing of just typing into chat GPT, yeah.
I think picking up off of that as well, there's something in there about follow-up questions. I mean, when you're talking to a human, you've got your 1 hour session, 45 minutes, whatever it is, and then, you know, it's cut and dry until the next week. You know, one of the use cases I've seen within my world, there's this organization called Synthetic Users, which provides the ability to emulate real user interviews. So it's part of kind of research and finding out what people think about your new idea for a product, for example. And they've got quite a high correlation rate between real user interviews and these synthetic user interviews, which is fascinating to me, but I won't dive into that. One of the powerful features that it has is that, and I'm not advertising for them, is that you're able to ask follow-up questions afterwards. You get this interview, which is an interviewer and interviewee conversing, both for AI, obviously, and they kind of produce this report, which is that this person with this background feels this way about this. And as I say, it's reasonably accurate. One of the things you can do is go back into their portal and ask follow-up questions. And I wonder whether there's something similar in the world of therapy, whether there's a Leo-trained large language model, a Shana-trained large language model, and just from, maybe even trained off of the podcast, just from the podcast, and then answer questions that people have following up after the session to get the help they need at the point they need it, as opposed to waiting until the next session rolls around.
That's a fantastic bit of thinking. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I can see it, because the way that therapy works often is that over time people will say things like, yeah, I heard you in my mind, or, you know, I was at this place and I thought, you know, if you were talking to me about this, what would you say? And obviously, like, sometimes the things that people say are like, okay, we don't go away with that. But so oftentimes as well, it is really like you realise that they have internalised you in a really real way, and they can predict what you might say, or they can at least take a pause to think, if somebody was here who really cares about me, and if somebody was here that was present with me at this time, what would they be like with me? And you know, so it would really support something like that if it was generated from in a personal way from an actual therapist that person had a relationship with, and then it would just be reminders. So not so much that it had to get the exact words right, because you never ask anything in exactly the same words twice, but that it got the ethos and the motivation accurate in a way that made it seem like this is not just parroting, because, you know, it's not just the exact words.
But Shauna, you've really hit something for me. That's amazing. Again, because what that makes me think, you're right. So what one of the things Shauna's referring to there is this idea of internalizing your therapist. And that's kind of one of the goals, is that, you get that validation that's external, and then it becomes part of your feeling and thinking. And then when we're not working together anymore, or they're not there, exactly as Shauna described, it can automatically arrive on your shoulder and give you a perspective that you wouldn't have got on your own, except you are getting it on your own because you've internalized it. And that is a very I think that's a really good analog for AI, that, you've done the learning and you've produced a version of that person, which is you, of course. And the other thing that made me think of was chair work or cushion work, which is where often, there's lots of circumstances where you might use this, and it's never so powerful, but like bereavement, for example, if there's unfinished business with somebody who's not there anymore, or some relationship, then there are some exercises and work you can do where you would have two chairs, one with the client in and an empty one, and they would have a conversation with this absent person and actually, ask a question, say a thing, and then they will move to the other chair and become the other person and answer as they imagine they would. It's very, very similar. That's obviously only their internalized version of that person. But it's not really, because it is entirely informed by their relationship with that person. So there is something very real about it, and it really can almost magically resolve an awful lot of can't think of the phrase, you know what I mean, unfinished business, or just, some kind of resolution that wasn't available. And that is, I really, sorry, I've gone off on one a little bit, because I find that quite exciting. And doesn't that make the idea of whatever AI's equivalent of therapy or parts of therapy might be seem so much less threatening? We already do it here, and we practice it with people. That could be, yeah, you're right, a very great extension of that. And it's not just about, the privilege of being able to afford. It's also just about the dearth. There just aren't anywhere near enough of us. Somebody I work with this very morning talked about, for the first time, really considering doing a therapy training, becoming a therapist, and I bit their hand off, because one, I already know they'd be brilliant, but there are, we need autistic therapists, particularly therapists generally, but especially, it's so hard to say. Yes, it's a supply and demand thing on both sides. But yes, internalizing, making your own version of your therapist, there's a lot to be drawn between that and whatever AI plays a role in there.
A thought that came to my mind then as well, that I love the idea of, is that, especially if it's something that's augmenting your therapy sessions, you ask it a question that's provided through to your therapist to be able to discuss through in more kind of following up at the next session, which seems to me kind of wonderful to capture on the go some of that thinking.
Yes, because a lot of people say, "Oh, I thought there's something I wanted to tell you or talk to you about, but it's not there." It's not there at the time. And generally speaking, actually, that's grand, because the right things will come off whenever they come off. So you also don't want to have too much and then lose the authentic connection just in the here and now moment that you actually had. But I can see that it just increases people's sense of not being on their own all the time, and even just for themselves, that they can keep in touch with themselves, even if it's like as part of their journaling or their just tracking their own lives. There's all sorts of ways that people benefit from things like that, and it's making it as friendly, I suppose, as possible, and not just having to record and write it down.
I moved away from a lot of my training when I was diagnosed and came out as an autistic therapist, because, so many of those, we talked about this on the podcast before many times, but, so many of the bits of models just don't work for autistic people often because they're too prescriptive or there's not enough. I always, my catchphrase is there's never a "it depends" tick box in any of the models. And one of the things, though, so I've been adapting bits and pieces of how I work, and one of the things is exactly that, especially ADHD as well. The chaos of there was something really important. I knew I wanted to bring it, and I knew I'd remember, and I can't remember. So I actually encourage people now. I say, look, I won't respond, but feel free at any point to drop me a voice note or a WhatsApp or an email or anything, and I'll just snooze it until the session, so that you can just externalize a bookmark, and somebody else will worry about bringing it back. And I don't, that's very hand-holdy. And I think that would go against a lot of core trainings, that you kind of help people in that way, when take responsibility for things that they should be responsible for. But this is an adaptation,
an accommodation.
It's an accommodation, absolutely. Yes, that's the word I wanted there. Right, it is absolutely an accommodation for something they cannot do.
Yeah.
And there's also
reminders. Some people need reminders of appointments, or they need
the first one of those ever today. How funny that you mentioned that today.
The first ever?
I scheduled, there's somebody I work with who consistently misses appointments and is not happy about it and really beats themselves up about it. And having missed several in a row, I said, look, I don't normally offer this. Would you like me to send you reminders on the day up to the appointment? They said, yes, absolutely. So because in Google Messages, you can schedule text messages. So I just wrote 7 repeating ones, and I'm going to have, and they will go out on the day, on the hour, until 10 minutes before the session. So it's actually very easy for me to do. But again, it's something that a lot of people would frown upon as too much hand holding. How are they going to learn resilience? I hate that word. If you keep helping them out with the things that they're struggling with. I think that partly that's really what we're here for.
Well, okay. First thing is,
I've gone too far.
No. There's nothing like that. No. I'm going to say I don't know how to do things like that. So you're also up against some autistic ADHD therapists who have no clue how to get sent out. So, but what all I do is put them in my paper diary, and I send them personal emails saying, you're seeing me tomorrow. But so we find a way. But I think your point is well made, that the world is hard enough, and it's not that I think people think we should not kind of baby people, because in the real world they're going to have to find their own way to appointments and pay if they miss or something like that. And I think there's something around saying, but it's not an equal playing field out there. And if it's an accommodation, and then some people will then learn and they'll start taking on some of that for themselves. And I find that people who never used to remember to pay, and then they start paying. And so they've got a system, and it's not because I've said, I'm not saying you because you keep forgetting to pay me. It's because they've developed their own system over time that they can take on that. And it's a really big achievement. With
the safety of knowing that they're being looked after while they do it, rather than never giving that support.
Yes.
And it's like the memory thing as well. I know that if I am paranoid about forgetting a thing, so I make a note, I probably actually won't need the note. The fact that I know that it's there gives me the safety to not panic and push it out of my mind. So it works on a number of levels. But also just not be shamed by it. I think that gives the environment to be able to learn, So if it's never really going to be a problem, I mean, not that it's never a problem. I mean, obviously we can't afford to run practices if people don't show up, but it's never that extreme, So, but working with people, and then from a relational standpoint, they begin to take on what they can. People do the best they can. So it's that whole kind of thing, like they begin to take on as they're in a safe relationship and they're less stressed about it. They can begin to take on all those extra things, which are really not what life's about. Like people get so hung up on that kind of stuff, and really, if it's going to get in the way of somebody having a relationship, then you do what you can to help that person to have a relationship, don't you? Really. Sorry, Daniel. Me and Leo are off on one here. That's all right.
It's interesting to hear the flip side of the coin. As someone that's been a patient of therapy, but not someone that's taken the training, I don't have that visibility of
okay.
strictness that's encouraged to hear it. I've gone through therapy in the past. At one point, a few years back, I had quite intense burnout, and I took off 3 months to kind of recover from that and unwind. And obviously, in retrospect, a lot of that was related to my autism and to pushing through. Well, I was experienced a lot of autistic demand avoidance, I think, and your episode a few weeks back, maybe a couple of months back now, helped me to explore that trait more in my mind. And, I had that feeling of being up against a rock and in between that and a hard place and not being able to progress and pushing through. And it led me to this burnout where I was, feeling constantly anxious. I was experiencing symptoms of depression and rated quite highly on both of those when I was seeking therapy. And to a degree, it was useful to talk to a neurotypical therapist who otherwise wasn't accommodating and adjusting. To be honest, the whole process, and this was even private, it was quite slow in that I'd already started to unwind more. By the time they actually came around, I'd already had probably at least a month off and, been spending a lot of time gardening, which I find lovely to kind of relax and wind, maybe even DIY, dare I say it. And by the time I was having these conversations, I wasn't quite as tense anymore. But, the way in which he approached things and worked through things was quite traditional CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of pointing me towards manuals, giving me homework to do. And it didn't land particularly effectively. And I don't think that's an uncommon challenge. I know that my wife has had much the same challenges. She's had a couple of CBT therapists, and in neither case have they actually landed well with her either. And quite interested if in the future I needed to explore it with an autistic therapist and to actually see those accommodations in action, because I have read about them and I can see how it would be useful and how it would really help tailor it to the individual and to help it land effectively.
I know there's people there are CBT therapists who are autistic and who are making that friendly to our community, but at the same time, autistic people usually need way more by the time they get to therapy. They've done the self-help, they've done that, they can search.
And even if it's not on purpose, even if they haven't sought out some book,
but they can think in that way.
That's how we do it anyway. We do the processes. When I was assessed for some therapy about 15 years ago on the NHS, and I remember I ended up with 2 assessments and I didn't understand why, and I can look back and see why, because they were going to give me CBT because that's what was available. And I remember the assessor saying, well, you've clearly been doing that already. You've gone through all of that because you've had the processes and the comparative thoughts and the spinning round and looking at it from the different angles. And so there's what else can we supplement that with that would actually add to what you've already done? And I went away thinking, oh, I'm so clever. Well, that's a shame because I'm still really, really miserable. And
what did they give you?
ACT, acceptance and therapy.
Okay.
That was my experience. That was my first adult experience of therapy. And it was brilliant. It was, it's mindfulness-based CBT essentially. And it did do what I needed it to do for those 12 weeks in a way that CBT alone would have just been a series of exercises, which I use with people too occasionally. There are a few little core exercises just to spot patterns, although most of the people I work with don't need any help now doing that kind of thing. Can I ask you, Daniel, this is going to be a podcasty question really, but I'm just, because you are the first listener, and I don't mean that to sound hierarchical, but I guess it is, that, that we've spoken to 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, how you actually found us, if you remember. I'm just, we don't know how that happens.
Oh, okay. So
I came through Reddit, so...
Reddit?
Yeah, there's
Reddit. People talking about us on Reddit.
A celebration. So I think it was through the Autism Translated subreddit, which I follow. As I say, I don't really use social media. Reddit's kind of the one exception. I don't really engage much. But since being a bit more on this discovery journey around my ASD, I have spent more time reading and occasionally posting. Like, probably count on my fingers the amount of times I've actually posted. But I think it was on that subreddit specifically when I came across mention of Autistic License, someone recommending it to someone that was, of course, one of the things you see on the self-diagnosis journey is people saying, go and listen to autistic content. And if you're relating to it, that's probably a pretty good sign you are autistic. So, I went out and I've read quite a lot of books, and one of them even inspired me to write my book. Different explanation. I won't digress into that. But one of those was someone recommending your podcast, Autistic License. And of course, I kind of got it on my podcast player of choice and downloaded. I can't remember which episode I listened to first, but I really enjoyed listening in and enjoyed the style of conversation, the pacing of it, and I was like, I'll listen to more of this.
Well, thank you. And that genuinely is really interesting. And,
it's fascinating because we
just don't have any, all we know is how many downloads fall off when we release an episode. That's it, really. We get some lovely feedback these days because we are inviting it, but no clue really as to what the journey might be. I know that's a tiny data set, so I won't go extrapolating it, but that's really.
I love to hear that though, because I barely know what Reddit is. Like sometimes when
it's the front page of the internet.
Whenever I put a question into Google, sometimes it comes up like Reddit, and that's all I know. Is there anything, Daniel, that you have on your mind that you were kind of hoping that we might get on to, that you want to bring in?
I didn't have particular things coming into this. I've written down a few things over the past couple of weeks in terms of what.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess one of my items on here is around what I've called grand cycles for myself, which I'm not sure if it's an AuDHD experience or what exactly it is. It's across my life, I would say, I have taken, over the course of several months, I'll focus on one thing and then I'll move on to the next thing. I suppose a reflection as I talk through it, it does sound what other people have described for AuDHD, but where I see it apply more often, so DIY, for example, the office I'm sitting in here and now, I built by hand. It's in the back of my garage. I built out a shell during my shed parental leave and, insulated, did all the plastering, etc. And in part supported by AI to understand where I didn't know things that I needed to know, the story. But what I quite often see is that year on year, I'll have an urge, a passion to do DIY, for example. I do it through the winter and into early spring, and then I will burn out on it until the next year. And that's kind of one of those grand cycles, for example. Then it takes me quite a while with some very unfinished projects, usually left around the house, to actually come back to them and finish them off, because it is a demand avoidance. It's a feeling that I just have absolutely no motivation to be able to do this thing or to be able to progress it or to be even able to start to tackle it. What I experience the rest of the year is this kind of the opposite of an attraction to it, a genuine repulsion from wanting to do this thing. And then it comes back around to this sort of time of year. And I've not had the urge just yet to start doing DIY again. Maybe this office was a little big of a project, but that I think is a good example of those kind of grand cycles that I go through, and it applies elsewhere too, like the gardening. I tend to do more late spring, early summer, by the time it's usually too late to have actually planted most things out. So I'm struggling to get things to actually grow properly. But that is the period of the year when I actually feel motivated to do this thing. And the rest of the year, I don't feel that motivation. And, looking further back to before I was in the position of owning a home, it was a question of, do I spend my time reading, or do I spend my time watching media, or do I spend my time listening to music? And that would usually be in these grand cycles of several months where I feel motivated to do one thing, but then it kind of peters out and I move on to the next thing. So yeah, I wouldn't say that's a common experience.
I'm liking though that I don't know if you've made up that idea, grand cycles. Is that your words, or have you read that?
I've just come up with that word. Yeah.
Well, I like that. We need to change that. That's Daniel's. So, grand cycles, and I've been kind of watching myself from a seasonal kind of a way, just in like the season of the year, and kind of going, this might not even be autistic, this might just be like, this is what I do in the winter and this is what I'm like in the summer, and that kind of thing, which I think is also part of it, and like our way of being as people who can get these special interests and get into them for a season and then move on, actually fits really, really well with the cyclical nature of time. Maybe autistic people are just attuned to that. But I also think this thing that you're talking about, the way that it comes around again, are you saying that like you do DIY maybe every year, it will come back, or does it sometimes just disappear and it just won't come back ever again?
It hasn't come back so far, but I did spend like about 3 months of breaking labour on building this office around me. Mm-hmm. So perhaps I burned out more than previous years, but I've certainly seen it, in previous years of doing big spurts of activity and then just get tired of it at one point, usually when spring starts to break in, or later in spring, and I just can't find the motivation anymore to get after it.
Yeah. There's a neurodivergent flavour to how intense the thing is, but it's almost like there's too much choice sometimes. And, maybe then what you're describing is, it's like you've got that ADHD need to move on to the new thing, but there's also that familiarity with the autistic strand of it, the autistic flavour of it, that goes, I can go back to that again, because there's something I want to do even better this time than what I did the time before. Yeah,
I dare say that transition period can be somewhat uncomfortable too. I think it's part of the two natures clashing to a degree, and some days I think having both autistic and ADHD traits is sort of a superpower. When you're really hyper focused on special interest, and it's something as well that, as it happens, plays out to be something quite productive, then you feel absolutely fantastic about it. And my book writing is a good example, I think, of that. I was doing easily 1,000 words a day, just kind of getting down content, and that was with a baby at home and with only managing half an hour to an hour a day of writing time. It just flowed.
That's impressive.
That's for sure.
Like you said before, Shannon, I'm getting a flavour of all of those little tendrils spiralling up. Yeah. It's following those and info dumping it out, and it's fun. And then I went through a period, kind of a grand cycle, but I'm picking it up again now, of not wanting to do anything with the book. So it's another application almost of it. It came up to mid-September and I did a conference presentation, and there was a lot to that. It was public speaking to 100 odd people, so it took a lot of preparation and a lot of psyching myself up to a degree. It was actually quite an interesting journey in that I think remembering a script, I feel like it's different for someone that is neurodivergent to someone that is neurotypical, because all of the advice was just keep repeating it. However many times I repeated it, I was like, I don't remember this any better than when I started. Instead, I kind of pulled together my own program, not a digital program, but a program of working, and I would record myself, get an AI to transcribe it, compare it to my golden script, and then find areas to improve. And it kind of led me to develop a new script, but one that I could actually replicate directly from mine, which was fantastic. It took a lot of practice still, twice a day for a week at least, each one an hour long. Somewhat there.
What we do is what we're here for. You said something. Oh, sorry.
No, you go on. I want to hear you talk about grand cycles, but ask your question, then we can come back to
well, no, because I'll come back. I'll come back because it'll take us somewhere else. That's all.
Okay.
Grand cycles. I had an image in my head that I've never had before, actually, the way I go through spins,
Yes.
which is, that they will be deep dive, they will be all encompassing. And then usually they have a lifespan and they die away and I don't come back to them. And then I think, well, no, but I've got 2 or 3 that have become part of routine, part of lifestyle, then they go on for years, potentially. However, they do also die away, I'm noticing recently. And the image that came in to my mind was in Times Square in New York, where they've got the kind of digital ticker tape and headlines and stock prices running around the corner of that building. Do you know what I'm saying, Daniel? And they all go at different speeds so that you can read them. It's a really good way of having lots of information pass by and be able to track them separately. So you've got these basically lines of text or whatever, but they travel along like a conveyor belt, but all at different speeds. So some are faster.
Wow, that would do my head in.
I can see why it does lots of people's head in, but I think I understand the logic of kind of being able to take things in multiply because they're not all running together and you're having to track them together. That is suddenly how I started seeing some of my special interests, that some of them are maybe not as intense or deep, but they will be very, very long running and they'll move through very slowly. Others will be very, very packed and will travel by very quickly. So it's that contrasts to the more singular sounding, and maybe there are other things, Daniel, that you meant, but that singular sounding grand cycle of this time of year, this thing comes into play and becomes very intense, and then that will peter out and this other thing will take over. That feel, again, I think I'm a bit envious of that, because it satisfies some of the autistic needs. It's predictable and you can repeat and learn from, or you'll be doing something that you've experienced before. And so that there's a lot of comfort in that. And as well, it's the reason I like that terminology of grand, meaning, to me, large, in that, it's substantial and it's got a little bit more permanence to it. That's very attractive. And I think I have a couple of those, but really the focus for me are those very intense, rushed, euphoric kind of explosions of, I just want to do this, I just want to do this. But then it goes away. And yes, like you were saying, Sean, it doesn't generally doesn't come back.
I wonder if it does and you just haven't noticed the things come back.
Maybe. And that was a secondary thought I was just having as you said that. Bits of them will probably get incorporated into something else. So even this podcasting is something I've always had a passion for, speech radio, and that's what I always wanted to do. And then for the last, it's actually 20 years since I listened to my first podcast, actually. So that's how long that's been around. It's been an intention. I've got everything I need to do it. I've got some experience. I should do that. But I needed another special interest to come in this case, neurodivergence, and other people, to arrive. And that then made it suddenly, almost overnight, a thing that I would do, even though it had been brewing for years and years in various guises of special interest. So yes, they do come back, actually.
They come back
in a more permanent way. I don't see it as that more satisfying sounding cycle pattern.
I think he does not have noticed it, though. I think that
what have you noticed? It sounds like you've noticed something.
Well,
I don't know.
No, I haven't noticed anything specific. What I'm thinking is sometimes whenever you get a new template or a way of looking at things, then you start to look back and just see it.
It adds some complexity. As we talk through this, I'm almost thinking at an abstract layer of these grand cycles and what does it really mean? Maybe it means that I like to be hands-on in a certain part of the year. And what I actually do in terms of DIY does differ quite significantly year to year. It's usually a very different project and usually something that's quite new, which I guess satisfies some of the more ADHD-based urges. But I wonder whether that is something that others would relate to, that if you take what it is that you look at from a more abstract perspective, whether it is then something more likely to recur.
Mm-hmm.
In your original email, this is what I was going to say before. In your original email, there was one thing you said, and I thought, oh, that's exactly how I would think as well. That you said, because I'd thought something similar. You're starting to have guests on, and I wonder if there are any kind of key comparative questions that would be consistent that you might ask everybody. And I hadn't thought of any, but that's exactly the kind of thing that I would have probably, got to eventually and regretted not doing earlier. And along those lines, I wonder if, and it's a put you on the spot question, so fuck it if you can't think of anything. But, we talked about reframing. We all, that's such a huge part of late diagnosis, reframing everything that went before. And in that process, have you thought of anything? What's the earliest kind of thing that you've thought of now, looking back, and think that was an autistic kid?
So probably the earliest one that comes back, and my long-term memory is very patchy, so one to bear in mind. I think it's another part of my neurotype been related to autism, but I've had aphantasia, to be specific.
Really?
Yeah, that's a different conversation. But do you want to say something, because the listeners may not know what that is? So you say it in your words to describe. Sure, yeah. So aphantasia is the inability to image things in mind, to think, kind of create an actual picture of things. And as I understand it, it varies on a scale as to what it is that you're able to imagine in your mind's eye, from being able to create these perfect pictures that are vivid in essence to essentially not being able to create that. And I think I'm more towards the completely aphantasic end of the spectrum. I can picture geography in my mind. If I go back to a city, I can know exactly where I am, even having just visited it once. And in building this office around me, again, I was kind of imagining how different bits of wood would slide together in order to build things eventually. It was really challenging. So studies have indicated that aphantasia can be quite closely linked with, well, in the first part, the ability to be able to think of things in abstract nature, to be able to take really complex things, and because you're not constrained by being able to put that into a picture in your mind, it means you can hold these disparate different threads that form a whole, which otherwise may not make sense to a lot of other people, or may take a lot more time to be able to kind of soak in. And again, this is one of the good things that helps with the line of work in which I am. It has also shown that memories can be quite flat in nature. People tend to describe it as it tends to remove some of the emotional connection from memories, and it's been described as kind of leaving them a little more grey. For me, specifically, what it means is that, or what I see in practice with it being applied, is that I don't remember faces or images. And as I understand it, that's a very big part of being able to take yourself back to a memory, and being able to access it. You kind of imagine a little bit in your head, and then you can pull yourself back to that context and pull that memory to the fore and be able to re-experience it, reimagine it. Comparatively, the further something is in the past for me, the less likely I am to be able to recall it, because I just don't have the context that's pulling it to the fore. I suppose eventually some of those memories just kind of disappear for not having ever been accessed in a very long time. So I know that there's quite a common experience around neurodiverse people that childhood memories can be patchy, for example, and that links back to complex trauma and constant re-experiencing of hardships, which weren't appreciated for what they were at the time. I don't think that's the case for me. And, this continues into adulthood, continues into good times for me. I wouldn't be able to remember. And I've ran into people, for example, from primary school or secondary school. And, how many years am I out of secondary school? Less than 20, 15-ish. And I don't remember these people at all. I ran into someone at a baby show last July, and they said that they'd been in my classes. I couldn't tell her from Eve. So lost the thread of where I was going with this aphantasia discussion now.
Well, I wasn't sure if you were going to say something about this is why I can't necessarily remember an early experience that I now frame as autistic, or whether it was the aphantasia itself that was the first thing in early life that framed as being an autistic child.
The form. You brought me back around.
Okay.
So, I don't have many memories of my childhood to be able to tap into. But the first one that I do recall is I was leaving primary school around year 4 in UK years. I don't know what that translates to in terms of age. Around about 9.
By 8 or 9, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we were moving to another village, some 30 miles away. So I was leaving that school and moving to another school. I can't remember if it was a card or a note, but another child had kind of written me a goodbye note, and I don't know if it was tongue in cheek or I don't really understand. It said, don't bully anyone else at your new school or something along those lines. And I'd been quite upset at the time and embarrassed and ashamed that my parents had seen it as well. In memory, there's something that I'd never really understood. And in rediscovering myself and reframing things, the only thing that I can come to in conclusion on that one is that I was someone that was very blunt, and it was perhaps something that was not received very well.
Or it was a complete irony, because you would never bully anybody, and they did that, because that's something, actually, we'll go into the whole context, but something that I've been thinking about, a thing that really gets under my skin, is when I feel like someone is seeing me as the opposite of who I actually am. And like there's something, maybe they knew you totally weren't, so they said the absolute opposite. But that gets us so much more, because we think, am I so misunderstood, or do I not know myself, or
and it points out how literally we hear those things, without questioning the irony that might be inherent. That's true.
That's a really good perspective. Thank you. It highlights this as being an autistic memory in either case.
Yes. So many ways with that. I'm fascinated by what you just said there about how you said it a wee while ago at the beginning of that. That was a really good definition of aphantasia, actually, much wider than I've ever heard before. And it was really balanced, because so often it's seen as a deficit. It's like, I can't do this thing. But actually, the thing that you said about the geography, and you're in a place and you know a place, so once you're there, you know it. Like, there is memory there. There is something that can be reconstructed whenever you're in it. It's different. And it's not yet understood. Yes,
but it's not constrained by visual.
It's better because it's not concretized in a... This has to be about this face and this particular event. It's much more wider than that.
I came across it kind of first a few years ago because of somebody I was working with who'd only recently discovered that he was aphantasic, or has aphantasia. And his particular illustration of that was that, people say if you can't sleep, count sheep. And he just thought, well, it rhymes. It's just a saying. It's because he had no concept that you might be able to project in your mind's eye an image of a fence and count sheep jumping over it in cartoon form or whatever. He held that for decades until somebody said, no, that's what I actually do. I close my eyes and I see. I close your eyes and you see. And that was his, pathway to realizing that this was not normal. This was not other people could do this and he couldn't. And it was, again, as Shauna was saying there, was just a total deficit. But I think in terms of, if I think about the people I know or have met who describe that, they are all in some way very, very creative and are able to have very, very creative minds in whatever form. And what you're saying today has really set that in my head as it's a taking away of a restriction, the restriction of only being able to just project an image as described. Yeah. That will get in the way of what you were describing, Daniel, of very complex geometry sometimes of how things might go together in different ways and what the most efficient way, because it's not clouded by that restriction of what it has to look like. Maybe I can't imagine exactly what it is you're describing, but I can see why it's a block, it's a barrier, having all those projections visually.
I mean, it has its challenges, of course.
Oh, yeah.
If I go to a venue full of colleagues especially who I haven't interacted with recently, it's stressful. On top of autistic tendencies already making it stressful, and worrying about the social interaction and the potential for masking, which of course I'm increasingly reducing the amount I mask. Yeah, just remembering who people are is something I feel a little dicey about when I walk into those kinds of environments. But overall, we have the brains we are born with. We're in the situation. We've got to find the positives, and there are plenty of positives to be found.
And such a big variety, because some autistic people are the opposite, and they walk into a room or they walk down a street and they see that person was in that class, that person was in that class, and they know the whole life story and of everybody, and that's overwhelming. I'm not like this, but I know some people that are, and it's like they're just as autistic as you are. It's just our brain. There's such a big spectrum, and I suppose that just comes down to that whole thing. Like we're really not the same, and we're all autistic. But it's just not clear cut that you'll have to. And why has this happened for each person? That there's some wisdom in that. There's some reason why your brain does what it does, because that fits together with all the other things and comes together to make your special interest, to make the things that make life joyous for you. And likewise, something can seem like a curse to one person, but actually it can be really, really helpful for an autistic person to feel like they've got all the information and other people don't recognize them. And, then you can use that to your advantage. So I think, there's maybe lots and lots of points with that, but maybe just a bit of a reminder in me that all of this is just fascinating. Everybody's just different. And we've got some of these words, and I don't know, help me. Somebody finish that for me. It's just...
But I think what you're doing there, Shauna, is you're describing exactly what we wanted out of these episodes. The idea of we know each other really well. We know how similar we are and how different we are, and that's still very singular. There's only there's two of us, and so what I'm definitely getting from today, and I think you are, is another very, very different autistic person, and we can all connect. We know that because we're all autistic, we're all AuDHD, but what a whole different range of experience.
Yes,
Daniel has had that, we couldn't have imagined.
Yes. Thank you for all that you shared, Dan.
Yeah.
It's really sparked so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation today.
Thank you for listening to the Autistic License podcast. You can connect with us via Instagram, Facebook, YouTube at autisticlicense.com or by email at autisticlicense@gmail.com. We spell license LICENCE. We also have a Facebook community. You can search for Autistic License Shauna and Leo. Shauna spelled SIANA, or you can click on the link in the show notes.